Hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Today I'm going to be talking to you about work conducted with Sahil Luthra, Phoebe Gaston, and Jim Magnuson about how people make use of multiple sources of information to interpret speech. Information at many levels of processing has been shown to influence speech perception. For example, consider the well-known Gnong effect, which demonstrates that phoneme responses and arguably perception is influenced by word knowledge. When listeners hear sounds that are ambiguous between a pair of contrasting phonemes, say "s" and "sh," we see response functions such as this. If these phonemes are embedded in a sang-shang continuum, listeners are more likely to report ambiguous phonemes as beginning with a "s," since sang is a word and shang is not. The same is true for the reverse situation, say a ser-share continuum, where we see more sh responses since only share is a word. These types of isolated effects on speech perception have been studied extensively. However, in more naturalistic processing environments, there are often multiple sources of information available to the listener. Thus, it is important that we understand how listeners use different types of information when processing speech, particularly when these sources of information may conflict. Specifically, we seek to understand what happens when listeners have two qualitatively different cues that occur at different times. For the purposes of this talk, we will focus on two types of information that influence perception: priming and co-articulatory context. Written word forms have been shown to influence identification of spoken words. Blank and Davis showed that participants' report of noise-vocoded speech was more accurate after a matching prime. For example, when listeners saw lion before hearing a noisy lion token, they were more likely to report hearing lion than after seeing a neutral or mismatching prime. Additionally, semantic priming has been shown to influence phoneme identification. Gaston and Toscano showed that after seeing a word like amusement, listeners were more likely to interpret a phoneme that was ambiguous between a b and a p as a p because of the relationship between amusement and park. While the influence of direct form priming on minimal pairs has not yet been shown, we would likewise expect this prime to influence phoneme identification. A second type of information that influences perception is co-articulatory context. This demonstrated effect is known as compensation for co-articulation, which I may refer to as CFC going forward. We note that while these effects have been observed across different contexts, there are alternative explanations for these effects, such as that they are the result of more general auditory context effects and not a result of knowledge of motoric co-articulatory constraints. For the purpose of this project, we note that the source of these effects is not important here, but rather just that they exist as another type of context that listeners use to interpret speech. Thus, we will proceed with a compensation for co-articulation framework. In these types of paradigms, listeners hear sound produced with a relatively back place of articulation. That is, this sound is typically produced further back in the mouth. One such example of this type of sound is a k. If a talker produces this sound, and immediately after produces a sound with a more front place of articulation, say a s, the talker may not reach that canonical place of articulation. In other words, they might not be able to reach that front place in their mouth. Hence, because that previous sound was so far back, they might produce that second sound at a point more in between their typical front and back places of articulation. Listeners appear to adjust their interpretations accordingly, interpreting that ambiguous second token as having the opposite place of articulation as the preceding phoneme. In the example here, listeners would interpret the token as a s despite the more ambiguous place of articulation, and would likewise interpret the token as a sh if preceded by a sound with a front place of articulation, for example, a ch. So to reiterate, there are multiple types of information that influence how people interpret ambiguous speech. With priming, we expect that if listeners are presented with a visual word form, say same, and then hear an ambiguous same-shame token, we would expect that listeners would report the ambiguous token as sa. We also know that if listeners hear isolate, ending with a t, which has a front place of articulation, and then hear that ambiguous same-shame token, we would expect that listeners would report the ambiguous token as beginning with a sh. This project is concerned with how people would interpret that ambiguous phoneme if they had two potentially conflicting sources of preceding information. We note that one source of information is early and immediately available, yet not part of the speech signal. However, The other cue is integral to the acoustics of the stimulus itself and occurs closer in time to the target item. This experiment will allow us to ask whether these two cues that differ in time and modality differentially constrain listeners' phoneme identification. If listeners do rely on both sources of information, this poses a challenge for existing theories of language processing, which would need to account for how two qualitatively different cues could have simultaneous influence. Before we can ask how listeners make use of both priming and CFC, we first need to test whether identity priming influences identification of ambiguous speech. While CFC effects have been robustly demonstrated, identity priming has not yet been studied with auditory minimal pairs. In order to test whether identity primes influence phoneme identification, we presented participants with a cross-modal priming paradigm. Namely, participants saw a written word and later heard an audio stimulus that started with a token along a 5-step sa-sh continuum. They then made a decision about the phoneme that they heard. We used 5 sa-sh minimal pairs that our team demonstrated can drive robust CFC, which will be important for experiment 2. Like I said, we presented participants with one of 5 continuum steps. Each trial had one of 4 gap durations. These durations were the length of the 4 auditory context items used in experiment 2, present here in order to mirror exact timing with experiment 2 for direct comparison. Each trial consisted of one of 3 written primes, either sa biasing, sh biasing, or neutral, which consisted of 8 hash marks. These 5 minimal pairs with 5-step continua presented with 4 gap durations and 3 written primes led to 300 trial combinations per block. Within each block, we also presented participants with 60 trials to make sure they were paying attention to the written prime, which consisted of the visual prime followed by no audio, and asked participants to type the prime they saw. We presented participants with 2 blocks of trials. We ran participants until we had a final sample size of 40, excluding people who failed our headphone check, were not accurate on endpoint tokens, timed out more than 10% of the time, and were inaccurate on our prime check trials. We selected our target sample size of 40 participants because sample sizes of about 20 have been used in other identity priming tasks, and post-hoc analyses revealed that a sample size of only 15 is needed to show effects that rely on CFC, and hence we were able to use the same sample size in our second task as well, which facilitated comparison. We now turn to our results. First, let me orient you to how we plot this data. Along the x-axis, we have our continuum step, ranging from our most sa-like token to our most sh-like token. The y-axis indicates the proportion of front place of articulation responses. In other words, proportion of sa responses. The colors of the lines indicate the different priming conditions. The green line indicates that the prime was a word beginning in S. The red line indicates that the prime was a word beginning in esh, and the blue line indicates trials where the prime was neutral. We see, for example, that the most ambiguous tokens, plotted at step 0, were more likely to be interpreted as starting with sa following an S biasing prime, and more likely to be interpreted as starting with sh following an esh biasing prime. Results from our linear mixed effects model revealed a significant effect of both prime and step with no interaction. Follow-up analyses also showed that all pairwise contrasts between our prime conditions were significant. These results hence show that written form primes influence identification of ambiguous phonemes. These findings align with evidence that semantically related forms influence identification of ambiguous phonemes as well. Now that we have established that identity form priming influences phoneme identification, we can now ask how listeners make use of 2 potentially conflicting sources of information to resolve ambiguities in speech. To do this, we present listeners with a primed CFC task. Like in experiment 1, participants saw a visual prime that was sa biasing, sh biasing, or neutral. Instead of the variable gap duration, they heard an auditory context item that either ended with a phoneme that has a back place of articulation, for example maniac, which ends with a k, or a front place of articulation, for example isolate, which ends with a t. There were 4 possible auditory context items. Participants then heard the auditory target item, after which they made a decision about what phoneme it started with, either sa or sh. This experiment contained the same number of trials and the same target items and primes as experiment 1, and the same participant exclusionary criteria. So let us walk through the results. Similar to how we displayed the results for experiment 1, we plot the continuum step of the target item along the x-axis and the proportion of front place of articulation responses, or SO responses, along the y-axis. The colors of our different lines again indicate the same priming distinctions as experiment 1, with green lines indicating the prime starting with an S, red lines indicating the prime starting with an S, and blue lines indicating neutral primes. Line type indicates the place of articulation of the final phoneme in the auditory context item. Here, you're looking at solid lines, which indicate that the auditory context item ended with a phoneme with a back place of articulation. For example, a K, such as in maniac. We would expect to bias listeners to hear the subsequent phonemes as having a more front place of articulation. Or, for example, hearing more S tokens. Dashed lines indicate the opposite, namely that the auditory context item ended with a phoneme with a front place of articulation. For example, isolate. This we would expect to bias listeners to hear the subsequent phoneme as having a more back place of articulation, or hearing more sh tokens. As is evident, particularly by examining the most ambiguous point at step 0, we see that participants were affected by both the prime and the auditory context. Namely, participants were most likely to respond that they heard S, for example, after seeing an S biasing prime and after hearing an auditory context item that ended in a black place of articulation, the solid lines. These findings were confirmed statistically, with our mixed effects model revealing a main effect of prime, step, and auditory context with no interactions. In order to address whether the effects of priming changed in the presence of another disambiguating cue to speech, we compared data from experiment 1 and experiment 2 in one model, treating experiment 1 as having a neutral auditory context. We were interested in whether a prime by context interaction would emerge, potentially indicating that the effect of prime differed in the presence of the biasing auditory token. However, we did not find such an interaction. In other words, the impact of the visual prime is not affected by the presence of a potentially conflicting co-articulatory context. Taken as a whole, these studies suggest that there is an additive effect of these two disambiguating sources of information. In everyday speech, which often contains varied and ambiguous acoustics, listeners have many sources of information available to interpret what they're hearing. While much research so far has examined how information from different levels of language processing can influence identification and arguably perception of ambiguous speech sounds, it is important to consider how listeners make use of multiple, sometimes competing sources of information. Many frameworks for language processing, such as interactive activation models, autonomous models, and Bayesian frameworks, have mechanisms for implementing information from multiple cues. In an interactive activation model like Trace, there are ways to simulate both priming and phonetic context effects. In a Bayesian model, of course, different kinds of priors can be integrated. A challenge for existing frameworks will be to simulate the additive effects we observed despite differences in modalities and timing, and to likewise consider the predictions that would then arise. For instance, considering situations in which cues shift in their reliability. To what extent do listeners actually use all available information, and when might reliance on different cues interact? Moreover, do all individuals use the same cues in the same ways? While there are many remaining questions, this work hopefully provides a first step in considering how two cues that are qualitatively quite distinct can simultaneously and independently influence language processing. With that, I would like to thank the organizations and individuals listed here for their support, and the Psychonomic Society for hosting this conference and giving graduate students the chance to speak about their work. Finally, I would like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.